There is a fundamental misunderstanding about how deception works within the walls of a church. We tend to think of a lie as a conscious act, a moment where someone knows the truth but chooses to speak a falsehood. But the most effective untruths, the ones that survive for centuries and shape entire civilizations, are not told by liars. They are told by believers. When a pastor stands at the pulpit, they are rarely trying to deceive you. They are usually repeating a script they have internalized so deeply that they can no longer see the edges of the stage. They are passing on a tradition of errors, a lineage of misunderstandings that they were taught to view as absolute truth. And because they trust their teachers, and you trust them, the cycle continues unbroken. The first, and perhaps most foundational untruth, concerns the book itself. The way the Bible is presented to a congregation is strikingly different from what we know it to be historically and textually. In the pulpit, the book is presented as a unified, coherent voice, a singular manual for living, written effectively by one author, God, using human hands as mere typewriters. But the reality that is widely known in academic theological circles, yet rarely whispered in the pews, is that this book is a chaotic library of conflicting voices. It was written by dozens of authors over a span of 1,000 years, authors who disagreed with one another, who had different political agendas, and who held vastly different views on the nature of divinity. When a pastor reads a verse, they are presenting it as a static, eternal command. They don't mention that the verse might have been added by a scribe 300 years after the original text was written. They don't mention that the ending of the Gospel of Mark, the very foundation of the resurrection narrative in that book, does not exist in our earliest and most reliable manuscripts. It was added later. To preach from that text as if it is the inerrant word of a deity without disclosing its human tampering is a lie by omission. But here is the catch. Most pastors don't know this either. Or if they learnt it in seminary, they were taught a mental gymnastic routine called apologetics to explain it away. They were taught that if you squint hard enough at the contradictions, they blur into a single image, and so they pass that blurred image onto you. This leads us to the concept of context. You will often hear that you must read difficult passages in context. This is the standard defense when the text appears to endorse slavery or genocide or the subjugation of women. The claim is that we are missing the cultural nuance, but this argument essentially defeats the purpose of the book itself. If a text is supposed to be the perfect, timeless guide for all humanity, why is it so heavily anchored in the barbaric norms of the Bronze Age? Why does the creator of the universe seem to have the exact same moral blind spots as a tribal warlord from the ancient Near East? When a pastor tells you that God's morality is objective and unchanging, while simultaneously making excuses for why God commanded the slaughter of children in the Old Testament, they are engaging in a profound cognitive disconnect. They are asking you to suspend your own modern, superior sense of ethics to accommodate an ancient text, all while telling you that the text is the source of your ethics. It is a circular trap. The lie here is that morality comes from the book. If you can look at a passage in the Bible and say, that part about owning people as property is wrong, then you are judging the Bible by a standard that exists outside of it. You are using your own evolved empathy and social reasoning to edit the Word of God. Pastors frame this internal moral compass as the Holy Spirit or the conscience given by God, but the evidence suggests otherwise. We see this same empathy in primates, in elephants, in social species that have never seen a scripture. The lie is the claim that human goodness is a divine import rather than a biological imperative for social survival. By telling you that you are broken and wicked without their doctrine, they create the sickness so they can sell you the cure. Then we must look at the mechanism of prayer. This is perhaps the most psychologically potent untruth peddled on Sunday mornings. The narrative is simple. God listens and God answers. When something good happens, it is a blessing. When something bad happens, it is a test, or a mystery, or part of a plan we cannot understand. This setup is rigorous and unfalsifiable. It is a perfect closed loop. If you pray for recovery and you recover, the prayer worked. If you pray for recovery and you die, God needed you home. There is no outcome that can disprove the hypothesis. What is being sold here is a classic case of confirmation bias, repackaged as divine intervention. A pastor will stand on stage and recount a story of a miraculous healing or a financial windfall that arrived just in time. These stories are powerful. They trigger an emotional release. But they never recount the thousands of prayers offered in that same congregation that went unanswered. The silent majority of petitions that dissolved into the air by highlighting the hits and ignoring the misses, they construct a reality where the deity is active and engaged. But if we analyze prayer with any statistical rigor, the effect disappears. We know from large-scale studies on intercessory prayer, particularly in medical settings, that it has no effect on patient outcomes. In fact, in some cases where patients knew they were being prayed for, they fared worse, likely due to performance anxiety. The pastor isn't lying because they want to trick you. They are lying because they are counting the hits just like you are. They are desperate to see a pattern in the noise. This desperation for a pattern extends to how they explain the world itself. There is a prevailing idea in the pulpit that the universe was designed specifically for us, the fine-tuning argument. You will hear them say that if the earth were just a little closer to the sun, we would burn, and a little further, we would freeze. This is presented as evidence of a designer who turned the dials just right. It sounds intuitive, it feels correct, but it fundamentally misunderstands the nature of life. We were not placed in a perfect environment. We adapted to the environment we found. It is the puddle waking up and thinking the hole it sits in was designed perfectly to fit its shape. By pushing this narrative of special creation, pastors isolate their congregations from the grandeur of reality. They shrink the universe down to a stage play about human behavior. The lie is that we are the main character. The reality that we are a momentary chemical accident on a dust mote suspended in a sunbeam is terrifying to them. It strips away the safety net. So they sell you significance. They tell you that the creator of 100 billion galaxies is intensely interested in who you sleep with and what you do on Sundays. It is an ego trip of cosmic proportions, sold as humility. We also need to talk about the concept of hell, because this is where the misunderstanding turns into something darker. Many pastors preach hell as a certainty, a literal place of eternal conscious torment. They use it as the ultimate leverage. But if you look at the history of the Jewish scriptures, the concept of hell as we know it is virtually absent. The word often translated as hell, Gehenna, was a physical valley outside Jerusalem. The concept of eternal punishment was a gradual theological invention, borrowing heavily from Greek mythology and intertestamental literature. It was not the original worldview of the authors of the Hebrew Bible. When a pastor threatens a congregation with hell, they are often projecting a medieval fan fiction onto an ancient text. They are wielding a weapon of trauma that was forged by the church to ensure compliance, and the tragedy is that they believe in the weapon too. They are just as afraid of it as you are. This shared fear bonds the leader and the follower. It creates a trauma bond. You are both huddled together, hiding from a monster that the system itself created. The lie is that the fear is external and necessary, rather than internal and manufactured. This brings us to the nature of the relationship they claim you can have with God. You are told that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. This is a brilliant marketing slogan because it sidesteps the baggage of organized religion. But let's examine the mechanics of this relationship. It is entirely one-sided. You speak and you interpret your own internal monologue or emotional shifts as a response. If you feel peace, that's God. If you feel guilt, that's the Holy Spirit. If you have an intrusive thought, that's the devil. They are teaching you to dissociate from your own psychology. They are teaching you to attribute your natural emotional states to external entities. This is why leaving the faith is so psychologically shattering. You aren't just losing a belief system, you are losing the voice in your head that you were trained to identify as a friend. The pastor tells you that the voice is God because they have done the same thing to their own mind. They have partitioned their own consciousness. When they say, God told me, they aren't lying in the sense that they are making it up. They are misidentifying the source of the signal. They are mistaking their own subconscious intuition for a divine frequency. We must also address the historical revisionism regarding the progress of society. You will hear it said that the church has always been the vanguard of morality and human rights, that without the church we would have no hospitals, no universities, no charity. While religious institutions have certainly contributed to these things, the narrative ignores the resistance. It ignores that the church often stood firmly against the very progress it now claims credit for. It stood against the abolition of slavery, using scripture as its shield. It stood against women's suffrage. It stood against civil rights. It stands today against the rights of sexual minorities. The pattern is always the same. The church resists moral progress, citing the Bible. Then, when society drags it forward and the old view becomes socially untenable, the church pivots. They reinterpret the scriptures to align with the new moral standard and then claim they were there all along. The lie is the claim of moral leadership. The reality is moral lag. The secular world, driven by empathy and reason, usually arrives at the humane conclusion first, and the pulpit eventually catches up, dragging its feet. Furthermore, consider the promise of transformation, the claim that accepting this specific set of beliefs will fundamentally change your nature, that it will cure your addictions, fix your marriage, and stabilize your mental health. While community and support groups certainly help people, there is no evidence that religious belief itself is a superior mechanic for behavioral change compared to secular counterparts. Christians divorce at the same rates as non-Christians. They struggle with addiction, depression, and anger at similar rates. The lie is that the theology is the active ingredient when the transformation doesn't happen, when the prayer doesn't cure the depression. The script flips to victim blaming. You didn't have enough faith. You have unconfessed sin. You aren't praying hard enough. This is the safety valve of the system. The product is never defective. Only the customer is defective. A pastor will rarely say, maybe this method doesn't work. They can't say that. It would unravel the entire tapestry. So they tell you to try harder, to dig deeper, to give more. It is a treadmill with no off switch, powered by your own feelings of inadequacy. There is also a subtle deception in how they handle the origins of the text's stories. Pastors treat the narratives of the Bible as unique, singular events: the flood, the virgin birth, the resurrection. They rarely mention that these motifs were common in the ancient world. Flood myths predate the biblical account in Sumerian literature. Dying and rising gods were a staple of ancient mythology. Virgin births were attributed to emperors and legendary figures. By isolating the biblical stories from their literary context, they make them appear miraculous. If you place them alongside the Epic of Gilgamesh or the stories of Horus or Mithra, they look less like history and more like cultural appropriation. They look like a specific culture's take on universal themes. But to admit this would be to admit that the Bible is a human book, and that is the one thing a pastor cannot do. To retain their authority, the book must be divine. It must be other. So they construct a firewall around the history. They discourage you from reading outside sources. They warn you against worldly wisdom. This intellectual isolation is necessary to maintain the illusion. It is not a malicious censorship. It is a protective instinct. They are protecting the faith of the flock, and in doing so, they are protecting their own employment and identity. We must also scrutinize the concept of faith itself. In any other aspect of life, belief without evidence is considered gullibility or delusion. If you bought a car because the salesman told you it ran on hopes and dreams, you would be ridiculed. But in the religious context, this suspension of critical thinking is rebranded as a virtue. You are told that doubting is a weakness, that requiring evidence is a sign of a hardened heart. This is a brilliant defense mechanism for a bad idea. If you can convince people that testing the product is wrong, you never have to worry about the product failing the test. Pastors praise childlike faith. Think about what that implies. Children are credulous. They believe in Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy because they trust authority figures implicitly. To elevate that state of mind to the highest spiritual goal is to infantilize adults. It is a lie that keeps you dependent. It discourages the very maturity and skepticism that are necessary to navigate a complex world. It trains you to accept assertions rather than arguments. And this training bleeds out into other areas of life. It primes the mind for other forms of manipulation. Consider the prosperity gospel, or even its lighter variations. The idea that God wants you to be successful and that your devotion opens doors. This links spiritual standing with material outcomes. It is the just world fallacy codified into doctrine. If you are poor, if you are sick, if you are struggling, there is a theological reason for it. It subtly validates the social hierarchy. It comforts the wealthy by telling them their fortune is a blessing, and it pacifies the poor by telling them their reward is coming, or that they just need to plant a seed of money to unlock it. This is economic predation masked as spiritual advice. Even well-meaning pastors who reject the hardcore prosperity gospel still often preach that God has a wonderful plan for your life. This creates an expectation of narrative cohesion that real life rarely provides. When tragedy strikes, the believer is left trying to fit a square peg of trauma into a round hole of benevolent planning. The deception runs deep into the linguistics they use. Words like love, justice, and freedom are redefined. Love, in a sermon, often involves the threat of eternal torture if the love is not reciprocated. That is not love. That is an abusive relationship. Freedom in the church often means the freedom to obey their specific set of rules. It is Orwellian. They use the vocabulary of liberation to describe a system of restriction. A pastor will tell you that true freedom is found in submission to God. But in practice, that means submission to the church's interpretation of God. It means submission to the pastor. They didn't realize it when they said it. They were repeating what their mentor told them, who repeated what their professor said, back through the generations. It is a cascade of well-intentioned error, a systemic blind spot that covers the eyes of millions. And the tragedy is that the world is beautiful and meaningful enough without the lie. We don't need a divine author to find significance in our lives. We don't need the threat of hell to be kind to our neighbors. We don't need a magical book to understand our origins. When we strip away the mythology, we are left with something far more interesting: reality. The raw, unedited, complex human experience. Pastors are selling a map to a territory that doesn't exist. They are guiding you confidently toward a mirage. And the moment you realize the water isn't real is the moment you can finally turn around and start walking toward the truth. It is the moment you stop listening to the voice in the pulpit and start listening to the evidence of the world around you. Let's look deeper into the architecture of this worldview, specifically at the scaffolding that holds it all together when the logic begins to buckle. One of the most pervasive untruths you will hear from the pulpit concerns the nature of doubt itself. Pastors often frame doubt as a spiritual attack. They describe it as a whisper from the enemy, a test of your resolve, or a symptom of moral failure. If you are questioning the validity of the resurrection or the morality of hell, they rarely suggest it's because the evidence is lacking. Instead, they suggest it's because you have taken your eyes off Jesus. This is a subtle form of gaslighting. It shifts the burden of proof from the claim itself to the person asking the question. The lie here is that skepticism is a defect. In reality, skepticism is the immune system of the mind. It is the tool we use to filter out bad information, scams, and danger. By disarming this immune system, the pastor renders the congregation vulnerable not just to bad theology, but to manipulation in general. They are teaching you that the sensation of cognitive dissonance, that uncomfortable feeling when facts contradict beliefs, is actually a spiritual red flag that you should ignore. They tell you to lean not on your own understanding, which is essentially an instruction to turn off the engine of your own intelligence. And when you do turn off that engine, you are forced to accept the paradoxes that the pastor presents as mysteries. Take the classic contradiction of free will and divine omniscience. You will hear a pastor speak passionately about how God has a perfect plan for your life, written before the foundations of the earth. In the very next breath, they will tell you that you must choose to follow God and that your choices determine your eternal destiny. These two concepts are mathematically incompatible. If a deity knows with absolute certainty everything you will ever do before you are born, you do not have free will. You have a script. You are acting out a play that has already been reviewed and approved. If you have the genuine freedom to surprise God, then He cannot be all-knowing. The pastor navigates this by simply refusing to look at the collision. They switch between the two ideas, depending on what the emotional moment requires. If you are grieving, they give you the God has a plan script to provide comfort. If you are sinning, they give you the free will script to provide guilt. They are using mutually exclusive tools to manage the crowd, likely without ever realizing that the toolkit is broken. This inconsistency bleeds into how they handle the problem of suffering. This is the heaviest weight on the shelf. When a tragedy strikes a natural disaster, a terminal illness in a child, the pastor has to walk a tightrope. They cannot say that God is powerless to stop it, because then He isn't God. They cannot say that God wanted it to happen, because then He is a monster. So they retreat into the fog. They use phrases like, God's ways are higher than our ways, or we cannot see the full tapestry. The lie here is the implication that there is a satisfying answer that we just aren't smart enough to understand yet. They are writing a promissory note for an explanation that will never be cashed. The brutal reality, the one they are shielding you from, is that the universe behaves exactly as we would expect it to if there were no overseer at all. In a godless universe, things happen randomly. Good people get sick, bad people get rich. Tectonic plates shift without regard for who is standing on top of them. The pastor tries to impose a narrative of justice and intent onto a system that is governed by physics and probability. They are trying to find a face in the clouds, and when the face looks cruel, they tell you it's just a bad angle. we must also talk about the straw man atheist. This is a character that pastors invent and parade around the stage to inoculate their flock against leaving. If you listen closely to how pastors describe non-believers, you will notice a pattern. They rarely describe an atheist as someone who simply looked at the evidence and found it insufficient. Instead, they describe someone who is angry at God, someone who wants to sin without consequence, or someone who is arrogant and hopeless. By misrepresenting the opposition, they ensure that you never actually listen to what the opposition has to say. It is a quarantine strategy. If you believe that every person who leaves the church is bitter, broken, or immoral, you will be terrified to step outside the bubble. You won't view leaving as a liberation. You will view it as a failure. The pastor isn't lying because they have met thousands of atheists and analyzed their psychology. They are lying because the system cannot tolerate the idea of a happy, moral non-believer. The existence of a fulfilled atheist disproves the necessity of their product, so they must paint the outside world as a dark, cold wasteland, even if the sun is shining brightly just outside the stained glass. This distortion extends to how they discuss the concept of the soul. Sunday after Sunday, you are told that the real you is an immaterial spirit, a ghost in the machine that drives the body like a car and floats away when the vehicle breaks down. This dualism is intuitive to us. We feel like we are inside our heads looking out, but everything we have learned from modern neuroscience contradicts this. We know that if you damage specific parts of the brain, you damage specific parts of the personality. We have seen cases like Phineas Gage, where a brain injury turned a gentle man into a chaotic, aggressive one. We see it in Alzheimer's patients, where the memory, the kindness, and the very self erode along with the physical tissue. If the soul were a separate, eternal driver, brain damage would be like a flat tire. The car wouldn't move, but the driver would still be intact. But that's not what we see. We see the driver fading away as the car rusts. When a pastor promises you that you will see your loved ones in heaven completely restored, they are glossing over a profound logical problem. Which version of your grandmother do you see? The one who died at 90 with dementia, who didn't know your name? Or the one from 40 years ago? If God restores her mind, he is essentially editing her. He is creating a new being that hasn't existed for decades. The promise of an eternal, unchanging soul is a beautiful comfort, but it ignores the biological reality that you are a process, not a static object. You are a collection of firing neurons. The pastor is selling you a permanent backup of a file that is constantly being overwritten. Let's shift to the social dynamics, specifically the us versus them mentality. The church often prides itself on community. They call it fellowship. And it is true, the social bonds in a church are strong, but they are strong in the same way a bunker is strong. They are defined by the threat outside. The pastor reinforces the idea that the world is fallen, dangerous, and dark. This creates a dependency on the church for safety and validation. The lie is that this community is based on unconditional love. It is arguably the most conditional love on the planet. It is conditional on your assent to a specific list of propositions. Try standing up in the middle of a small group and saying, "I don't think the Bible is true." Watch how quickly the warmth evaporates. Watch how the pity sets in. You will see the mechanism of soft shunning. You are no longer part of the in-group. You are a project. You are a problem to be solved. This creates a subtle pressure to conform. You mimic the language. You raise your hands during the music. You nod during the sermon, not because you feel it, but because you don't want to be the outsider. The pastor praises this conformity as unity in the Spirit. But often, it is just social survival. It is the herd, instinct. They are not shepherding a flock. They are managing a social club where the dues are your intellectual honesty. And, speaking of dues, we cannot ignore the financial structure, the concept of tithing. You will hear that giving 10% of your income is a biblical mandate, a way to honor God. They will read from Malachi, "Bring the whole tithe into the storehouse." They don't mention that the biblical tithe was food, crops, and livestock intended to feed the Levites who weren't allowed to own land. It was a taxation system for a theocracy, not a check written to a 501c3 non-profit to pay for a sound system and a mortgage. The lie isn't that the church needs money to operate. Any organization does. The lie is framing the donation as a transaction with the divine. Pastors will tell you that you cannot outgive God. They imply, sometimes subtly and sometimes explicitly, that financial struggle is linked to stinginess toward the church. This exploits the vulnerable. It takes money from people who are drowning in debt, people who need that 10% for rent or retirement, and tells them that giving it away is the only path to security. It is a financial placebo sold at a premium price. Consider also the obsession with the end times. For 2,000 years, pastors have been telling congregations that we are living in the last days. Every war, every earthquake, every political shift is cited as proof that Jesus is returning any minute. This creates a state of constant, low-level anxiety. It keeps the believer on edge. But more destructively, it breeds a nihilism about the future of the planet. Why worry about climate change if the world is going to burn anyway? Why fix systemic injustice if the Antichrist is about to take over? The rapture theology allows the believer to check out of their responsibility to the earth and to future generations. The pastor isn't trying to destroy the planet, but they are preaching a worldview that makes preserving it irrelevant. They are teaching you to look at the world as a disposable wrapper for the soul. This is a dangerous lie. It steals the future from our children by telling us that the future doesn't exist. Then there is the matter of sexual purity. The church has spent centuries obsession over human sexuality, purity culture, which reached its peak in the 92nds and 2000s, but has deep roots, teaches that your value is diminished by sexual experience. They use analogies like chewed gum or a flower with its petals torn off. These metaphors are deeply damaging. They teach young people, especially women, that they are commodities, that their worth is located in their history rather than their humanity. The pastor tells you that God designed sex for a very specific context, heterosexual marriage, and that anything outside of that is destructive. But when we look at the data, we see that purity, education, leads to higher rates of teen pregnancy and sexually transmitted infections, because it denies access to information and contraception. It creates shame where there should be education. It creates secrecy where there should be communication. The lie is that repression leads to holiness. In reality, repression creates obsession and dysfunction. By demonizing a natural biological drive, they ensure that it becomes a source of guilt rather than joy. They break your relationship with your own body so they can sell you redemption for it. Furthermore, think about the concept of absolute truth. Pastors love to claim that without God, truth is relative and therefore meaningless. They claim that they possess the objective standard. But look at the history of the church. Their absolute truth changes every few generations. It used to be absolute truth that the sun revolved around the earth. It used to be absolute truth that lending money at interest was a sin. It used to be absolute truth that kings ruled by divine right. The absolute is surprisingly flexible. It bends to the will of the culture. just on a delay. What they are actually defending is not truth with a capital T. They are defending tradition. They are defending the way their specific tribe has interpreted the world for the last 100 years. By calling it absolute, they shut down the conversation. You cannot debate the absolute. You can only obey it. This arrests intellectual development. It stops the search for better answers because you are told you already have the final one. Perhaps the most heartbreaking lie is the one about unconditional worth. Pastors will tell you that you are fearfully and wonderfully made. But the entire Christian theology is predicated on the idea that you are essentially worthless without intervention. Total depravity is the theological term. The doctrine says that you are born, broken, sinful, and separated from God, that your righteousness is as filthy rags. They build you up with one hand and tear you down with the other. They tell you that you are loved, but that you deserve eternal torture. They tell you that you are a child of God, but that you are by nature a child of wrath. This push and pull creates a psychological dependency. It is the dynamic of an abusive partner who says, "You are nothing without me, but I love you anyway." You internalize the idea that you are fundamentally flawed, that your instincts are wrong, that your heart is deceitful. This self-distrust is the anchor that keeps the ship in the harbor. If you trusted yourself, your own reason, your own moral intuition, you would sail away. And they didn't realize it. The pastor standing there, genuinely tearing up as they plead with you to accept this message, believes they are throwing you a lifeline. They don't see that they are the ones throwing you into the water. They are victims of the same bad ideas. They have sacrificed their own intellectual freedom, their own weekends, their own finances, and often their own authentic personalities to serve this machine. They are caught in the same web, just closer to the center. The realization of this isn't a cause for anger, but for clarity. Once you see the mechanism, you can't unsee it. You realize that the morality they preach is actually less moral than your own secular ethics, which are based on harm and well-being rather than obedience. You realize that the peace they offer is actually just the temporary relief of anxiety that they induced. You realize that the truth they hold is fragile, which is why it must be guarded so fiercely. We need to turn our attention to the intellectual defense systems that pastors rely on, the industry known as apologetics. When you ask a difficult question like why a loving God allows cancer in infants, or why the Bible supports slavery, the pastor rarely gives a straight answer. Instead, they retreat into complexity. They might quote C.S. Lewis, or talk about theological nuance, or dispensationalism. This is a strategy of exhaustion. The goal is not to explain the contradiction, but to bury it under so many layers of academic-sounding jargon that you simply give up. The lie here is the pretense of depth. They act as if there is a profound, satisfactory answer that you just haven't studied enough to grasp. But when you strip away the vocabulary, the answer usually boils down to, "We don't know, just trust us." They use complexity to hide the vacuity of the position. It is a shell game played with words. Consider how they handle the history of their own religion. A pastor will talk about the early church as if it were a unified group of believers, holding hands and singing hymns. They don't talk about the centuries of vicious infighting, where different sects of Christians murdered each other over the definition of the Trinity. They don't talk about how the books of the Bible were voted on by committees of men with political motivations. They present the canon of Scripture as if it fell out of heaven in a leather binding. By sanitizing history, they rob you of the context needed to evaluate the religion objectively. They present Christianity as a divine inevitability, rather than what it actually is. a cultural survivor that won a war of ideas through political power and suppression. The lie is that the survival of the church is proof of its truth. In reality, the survival of the church is proof of its ruthless efficiency in acquiring power. This leads us to the God of the gaps. This is the shrinking territory that the pastor tries to defend. Throughout history, we used God to explain everything. Thunder was God bowling. Disease was God's punishment. Famine was God's anger. As science advanced, God was evicted from these explanations. We learned about meteorology, germ theory, and agriculture. God's territory shrank. Today, the pastor has to work very hard to find a place for God to live. They usually stash him in the places science hasn't fully illuminated yet. The origin of the Big Bang, the exact mechanism of consciousness. They point to these mysteries and say, "See, that's God, but this is a losing bet." Every year, the flashlight of inquiry gets brighter, and the shadows where God hides get smaller. The pastor is selling you a God who is constantly retreating. They speak with confidence about God's sovereignty over nature, but when they get sick, they go to the doctor. They trust the science they claim is secondary. Their actions reveal their true hierarchy of trust. We must also discuss the sunk cost fallacy as it applies to the clergy themselves. This is crucial for understanding why they keep preaching even when the arguments fail. Imagine a pastor who has spent 4 years in seminary and 20 years in the pulpit. Their entire livelihood, their social status, their retirement plan, and their identity are tied to the church. If they wake up one morning and realize it isn't true, what can they do? To admit the lie would be to implode their life. They would lose their job. Their friends would shun them. Their marriage might end. They have no transferable skills for the secular marketplace. So, they suppress the doubt. They engage in motivated reasoning. They force themselves to believe because the alternative is personal ruin. They aren't just lying to you. They are trapped in a cage of their own making. There is a tragic phenomenon known as the Clergy Project, a confidential community for religious leaders who no longer believe but cannot afford to leave. There are pastors in pulpits right now preaching sermons they don't believe because they have a mortgage. They are actors in a play that they know is fiction, but they can't walk off the stage. This entrapment extends to the congregation through the weaponization of grief. The promise of the afterlife is the church's bestseller. When you lose someone you love, the pain is unbearable. The pastor steps in with a painkiller. You will see them again. They are looking down on you. This is a beautiful thought. It is also an unverified claim sold to people in their most vulnerable moments. The lie isn't just that the afterlife exists. The lie is that life is meaningless without it. They teach you that if this life is all there is, then nothing matters. This is a profound insult to existence. If you have a delicious meal, does it cease to be delicious because the plate will eventually be empty? No, the scarcity makes it precious. By telling you that the real life starts after you die, they encourage you to devalue the only life you actually have. They turn the earth into a waiting room. They teach you to endure rather than to live. Think about the concept of glory. Pastors are obsessed with doing things for the glory of God. But what does this actually mean? It paints a picture of a deity who is obsessed with his own press coverage, a being who creates a universe just to have the inhabitants tell him how great he is. If a human behaved this way, demanding constant praise, threatening those who refused, and taking credit for every success, we would call them a narcissist. We would call it a pathology. Yet, the pastor frames this cosmic narcissism as the ultimate virtue. You are told that your purpose is to be a mirror. This strips you of your own agency. Your achievements aren't yours. they are God's. Your talents aren't yours, they are loans. It is a psychology of negation. You must decrease so He can increase. The lie is that you are not enough, that you are merely a vessel. But look at what humans have achieved. We have cured diseases, walked on the moon, written symphonies, and mapped the genome. We did that. Us, the evolved apes. To give the credit to a silent deity is to steal from the human spirit. And let's look at the personal relationship narrative again, specifically regarding guidance. You are told to seek God's will for your life. This leads to a paralysis of decision-making. You see people waiting for a sign before they take a job or date a person. They look for hidden messages in license plates or random songs on the radio. This is patternicity gone wild. It trains you to abdicate responsibility for your own choices. If the choice turns out bad, it was a test. If it turns out good, it was favor, but you never really own the decision. The pastor encourages this dependency because it keeps you coming back for calibration. If you believed you were capable of making wise, ethical decisions using your own reason and experience, you wouldn't need the sermon next week. You wouldn't need the shepherd if you realized you weren't a sheep. There is also a dark side to the forgiveness model. The church teaches that all sins can be forgiven by God instantly. On the surface, this sounds therapeutic, but in practice, it often short-circuits the process of restitution. If a person harms you and they pray to God for forgiveness and feel washed clean, they may feel no obligation to make it right with you. They have settled the account with the CEO, so they don't need to worry about the employee they hurt. We see this in abuse scandals constantly. The abuser claims to have repented, the church welcomes them back, and the victims are told to forgive as God forgave. It prioritizes the feelings of the perpetrator over the safety of the victim. The lie is that forgiveness is a vertical transaction between a human and a God. In reality, forgiveness is a horizontal process between humans, and it must be earned. The cheap grace peddled from the pulpit undermines true accountability. Then there is the war on culture. Pastors often frame the secular world as hostile. They talk about the secular agenda. They act as if there is a conspiracy to destroy the faith. This is a siege mentality. It is designed to keep you inside the castle walls. But if you actually step out into the secular world, you don't find a conspiracy. You find people just living their lives. You find people who are kind, moral, happy, and completely uninterested in destroying your faith. The secular world isn't angry at God, it's indifferent, and that indifference is what terrifies the church more than hatred. Hatred validates them. It makes them feel like martyrs. Indifference proves they are irrelevant. The pastor projects hostility onto the culture to prevent you from realizing that the culture gets along just fine without their theology. We should also touch on the mystery of the Trinity. This is the central doctrine of the faith, and yet, by admission, it makes no logical sense. 3 persons, 1 essence. Fully distinct, yet fully one. Pastors will tell you it is a holy mystery that transcends logic. But if we are honest, it looks exactly like what happens when you try to merge 3 different God traditions into one monotheistic framework and refuse to delete the contradictions. It is a committee decision enshrined as dogma, and by asking you to accept a logical contradiction as the foundation of your reality, they break your trust in your own logic. Once you accept that 1 + 1 + 1 = 1, you are ready to accept that genocide is love, that eternal torture is justice, and that a cracker is human flesh. It is the first domino. They also sell you on the idea of objective morality. The claim is that without God, we are just animals doing whatever we want. Absolute moral chaos. If there is no God, murder isn't wrong, it's just unpopular. This is a terrifying thought to plant in someone's mind, but it is demonstrably false. Secular societies look at Scandinavia, for example, are often more peaceful, more charitable, and less criminal than highly religious societies. We don't need a stone tablet to tell us that hurting people is bad. We have mirror neurons. We have the evolutionary advantage of cooperation. We know that if we go around killing people, we will likely be killed, and our species will die out. Our morality is rooted in our biology and our social contract. The lie is that we are monsters on a leash. The truth is that we are social animals who thrive on connection. The pastor didn't realize it, but by teaching you that your morality comes from an external source, they made your morality fragile. If you lose your faith, you might feel like you've lost your reason to be good. This is the damage they do. They tie your basic decency to their theology, so if the theology falls, it threatens to take your decency with it. But it doesn't have to. Your decency was yours all along. It preceded the belief. Finally, consider the Great Commission, the command to go out and convert the world. This turns every believer into a salesperson. It commodifies friendship. When a Christian invites a non-believer to coffee, there is often an ulterior motive. They are scanning for an opening. They are looking for the God-shaped hole. This prevents genuine connection. You can't truly be friends with someone if you view them as a project to be fixed. The pastor frames this as love, as saving souls, but to the recipient, it feels like being targeted. It feels like arrogance. The lie is that you have the cure for everyone else's life. It creates a barrier of superiority. It isolates the believer from the richness of human diversity because they are forced to view everyone else through the lens of saved or lost. As we peel back these layers, we see a structure that is designed to protect itself at all costs. It uses fear, guilt, community, and circular logic to build a wall around the mind. The pastor is the guard on the wall, pacing back and forth, shouting warnings about the wolves outside. But they have never actually been outside. They were born in the fort. They were raised on the stories of the wolves. They are guarding you from a threat that is largely imaginary, to keep you inside a system that is largely exploitative. When the spell finally breaks, it doesn't happen with a thunderclap. It happens quietly. It's the moment you look at the pastor on stage, sweating under the lights, pacing back and forth, trying to work up an emotional response in the room, and you suddenly realize he's just a guy. He has no special phone line to the creator of the universe. He is just a man doing a job, repeating a script that was handed to him. The authority evaporates instantly. The fear of questioning him vanishes because you realize there is nothing behind the curtain. It is a moment of profound disorientation, yes, but follows quickly by a massive rush of liberation. The heavy coat of inherited guilt slips off your shoulders. You realize that you were never broken. You were never depraved. You were just human. The constant background noise of anxiety. Am I praying enough? Is God mad at me? Is the rapture happening today? It all just goes silent. And in that silence, you can finally hear your own thoughts. You start to look at the world through clear eyes, unfiltered by ancient mythology. And what you see is infinitely more magnificent than the diorama they showed you in church. The universe of science, a universe of billions of galaxies, evolving over billions of years, is far grander than a 6-day construction project by a tribal deity. The real story of life. the slow, beautiful grind of evolution that connected you to every living thing on this planet is far more inspiring than being molded out of dirt. You realize that the randomness of the universe is not terrifying, it is freeing. It means you are not a pawn in a cosmic chess match. It means your mistakes are just mistakes, not sins against an infinite being. It means that when bad things happen, it's not because you are being punished, but simply because that is the nature of a complex system. You are off the hook. And then you have to grapple with meaning. The pastor told you that without God, life is meaningless, but you find the exact opposite is true. When you realize this is the only life you get, it becomes unbearably precious. Every moment has infinite value because it will never happen again. You don't need an eternal backdrop to make the present meaningful. A kiss, a good meal, a sunset, helping a friend. These things carry their own weight. You realize that morality didn't disappear. In fact, it became more robust. You don't help your neighbor because you are afraid of hell or because you want a reward in heaven. You help them because you have empathy, because you know what it feels like to suffer and you want to alleviate it for others. That is a mature morality. It's doing good for goodness sake, not for a treat. You take ownership of your ethics. You can finally say, slavery is wrong. Full stop. You don't have to add, but God allowed it back then because of the hardness of their hearts. You can just be decent without the excuses. The hardest part, of course, is facing mortality without the anesthesia. The church sells a cure for death. When you realize the cure is a placebo, the reality of the end comes rushing back. It is scary. It is sad to know that you will lose the people you love and that eventually you will cease to be. But this sadness is the price of admission for being alive. It is what gives love its urgency. If you were going to live forever, nothing you did today would matter. You could always do it tomorrow or in 1,000 years. The fact that your time is limited is what gives it value. A book is defined by its final chapter. A song is beautiful because it resolves. You learn to accept that you are a pattern of energy that will eventually dissipate. You are the universe experiencing itself for a brief, shining moment, and that is enough. As you walk away from the system, you might feel a twinge of pity for the person still in the pulpit. They didn't realize they were lying. They were victims of a multi-generational con game, brave enough to stand up and lead, but conditioned to lead people in circles. They sacrificed their intellectual honesty on the altar of tradition. They are trapped in a smaller world than the one you have just stepped into. You don't need to be angry with them. You just need to keep walking out of the shadows of the sanctuary and into the night. Stark, beautiful light of reality. It's cooler out here, it's less certain, but it has the distinct advantage of being true. And once you have tasted the truth, the comfortable lie never tastes the same again.